Journey IFC strives to create safe spaces to worship God. Know that you are welcome just as you are, regardless of religious background or lack thereof, skin color, political affiliation, sexuality, age, culture, or any other label you own or society throws on you. You are welcomed and celebrated here just as you are.
Hi, I'm Natalie.
Hi, Natalie.
Our reading today comes from 1 Samuel, and we'll be focusing on the story of a woman called the witch or medium of Endor. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. Saul had expelled the mediums and the wizards from the land. The Philistines assembled against the Israelites. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, not by dreams, or by Urim, or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her." His servant said to him, "There is a medium at Endor." So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and went there, he and 2 men with him. They came to the woman by night, and he said, "Consult a spirit for me, and bring up for me the one whom I name to you." The woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done, how he's cut off the mediums and the wizards from the land. Why then are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death?" But Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" He answered, "Bring up Samuel for me." When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Have no fear. What do you see?" The woman said to Saul, "I see a divine being coming up out of the ground." He said to her, "What is his appearance?" She said, "An old man is coming up. He is wrapped in a robe." So Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground in respect. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Saul answered, "I'm in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. So I've summoned you to tell me, what should I do?" Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you just as he spoke by me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you today. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. The woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, "Your servant has listened to you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you've said to me. Now therefore you also listen to your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you. Eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he got up from the ground and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fatted calf in the house. Isn't that convenient? Talk about a hostess. She quickly slaughtered it, and then she took flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened cakes. She put them before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. What a story.
Thank y'all for hanging there. That's a meaty story. I wanted to get all the points in there. It was long, but don't worry if you missed some parts of it and you got lost, we're going to go over it again. Today, we're actually talking about the Witch of Endor, which I'm really excited about. I said I didn't know much about this story, and it's actually why we chose this story, our Soul team, in particular, Anne Lacasio. Thank you so much for suggesting this. Let's give her a round of applause. She said, I have never heard anyone preach on this story and this woman, and so we said, bet. We'll do it right now. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about this Witch of Endor. And it makes sense that we don't know this story because it deals with witchcraft, and there's a lot of weird cultural stuff against witchcraft. This is a hot topic for a lot of Christian circles, at least of the evangelical type and the ones that I was surrounded by growing up in Plainview, Texas. I had many friends who weren't allowed to watch Harry Potter. For some older people, maybe you knew people that weren't allowed to watch Bewitched. I don't know what y'all watched, but I knew a lot of people who could not watch these shows because their parents feared that they were going to be tainted into witchcraft. It was going to do something bad to them. This was evil. This was wrong. But today we're going to sit with this story. We're gonna look at it, and it's interesting because the Hebrew Bible has a lot to say about witchcraft or wizardry or necromancy, whatever we want to call it, all the many terms. Hebrew Bible doesn't say great things about it. They were a different religion in a sense, and the witches had power, and this went against the Israelites' understanding of God and the world and their understanding of power, and so they actually made laws against witches and witchcraft. But I think this really boils down to something that's really important, is that the witches were women who had power, and that went against the Israelites' understanding of patriarchy and power and the way that they showed up in the world. So what they did is they saw these women with power and they made them illegal and banished them out. Anne shared a quote with us in our Soul Team meeting that I thought was really fascinating. It's kind of is how I centered myself in this text this week as I was studying it. She found this on a meme, but it said, "Who taught us to fear the witch and not the one who burned her at the stake?" And I thought that was an interesting point. We've made such a negative view of witches that when we come to this story, we assume a lot. We think that the witch is going to be the bad, evil person, and it's not that clear. So today our story takes place in a transition period that we've been talking about for the past several weeks. And at this point, Israel, before they had judges, were these military leaders that would rise up and fall away. They kept failing. This leadership style wasn't working for Israel. And so this was really pushing them to this period of having a king or a kingship where there was a centralized leader who could command the people. And they saw that kingship was a divinely ordained thing. So they thought that God chose who was going to be king. But this also meant that God got to choose who is not going to be king. And that's kind of what is happening right here in this transition period. At this point in the Hebrew stories, the last judge / prophet, this before the kings, his name was Samuel, and he has just recently died. And right now, King Saul is in power. He's been reigning for a while, but his time is coming to an end. His power is slipping from his fingers in this moment. And so David, who you know David and Goliath probably, he's kind of the next one coming up in power. And so Saul's kind of being pushed to the side, and David is about to take the throne in place of King Saul. And Saul is upset. Saul knows that he's losing favor, and he knows that his power is draining from him. He's losing his privilege in this moment. And at this point, Saul has also been losing his sanity, his health, his mental health, his reign. Everything was deteriorating. Everything was going to crap, basically, for him. And he was just desperate to hold on to any power or favor and any bit of this kingdom that he could. So he becomes really desperate. In fact, so desperate that when David is coming up and is anointed by God and Samuel, Saul gets upset and he tries attacking him and tries killing him multiple times. Saul has not been obeying God for some reason or another. It's kind of a complex story, but at this point we know that Saul's losing his grasp on his mental stability and also on his power in the world. And now he's not obeying God, and he's doing some sketchy things, so his end seems inevitable. Our story today tells us that Saul has recently outlawed all spiritists or mediums or witches or necromancers, or whatever we want to call them. He's made all of that illegal. Just like this story of this woman, the witch, she is made illegal. They aren't allowed to practice their religion, their way of life, and they've been expelled from the land. They've been forced into this migratory nature. They've been kicked out of their homes because of the way they practice in the world. Saul has made it illegal for them to live and work and heal, do the things that works in their life and feeds their community. Because these witches, like I said, were a danger to his failing power, and so they were banned. They were kicked out because he was trying to retain any power he could. So Saul finds out in this moment that the Philistines are setting up camp and they're coming against him. And he's terrified. He knows that they can overtake him. He's already weak, that the Israelites are in danger, and he's terrified. And so in this terror and in this fear of losing his power, he's confronted with this other regional power that could overcome him. So he reaches out to God for help, saying, God, I need you, I need something. I don't know what to do. The Philistines they're setting up camp against us. They're going to kill us. And the story says that God does not answer Saul's request. He doesn't respond. He doesn't say anything. Saul seems to be on his own. He even reaches out to God through dreams. He also uses Urim, which are these kind of like dice. They're rocks that they threw, and they consulted them in some way, but none of it was getting him an answer. He was completely alone, and God was completely silent, it seemed. So Saul, in his terror and recent abandonment from God and his rejection from his people, he searches for another power that can help him secure his own power. So Saul sends some people to find these witches, these mediums, these necromancers, these people that can talk with the dead, because he wants to reach out to Samuel. He wants to hear from his mentor who brought him up to know what to do next. And he misses him. He's like, Samuel, if I can talk to him, I'll know what to do. But we remember that he has recently banned witches from practicing their spirituality, and he's expelled them from the community. But now he's in search of these witches that he's sent out to help him. Saul's men go searching, and they eventually find a witch in the town called Endor. And so Saul dresses up in a disguise and goes at night because he just made them illegal. How is he going to get help from them if he goes in his normal clothes, if he goes and shows up as a king? So he disguises himself and heads to Endor with a couple of his men. When they find this woman, this witch, who we should know is unnamed, is not given an official title here besides this witch, he comes to her and he immediately orders her to do something. He says, consult a spirit for me, one that he will name. She doesn't get me saying this. He's giving all the directions. He has the power, right? And so the witch responds saying, well, you know that King Saul has made this illegal. What are you doing? You're trying to set a trap for my life, trying to get me killed for practicing this. I'm just trying to stay alive. What are you doing? But Saul says, I swear you'll be safe. I promise you nothing will happen if you can just do this for me. And so she reluctantly agrees because she doesn't really have any power in this. This isn't really a consensual relationship. This strange man has showed up in the night in this disguise and started barking orders at her, and so she just has to go along with it. And so Saul says, please bring up Samuel for me. And at this moment, the witch brings up Samuel, and then she realizes, hey, who would bring up Samuel if not Saul? You're Saul. You're the guy who just made me illegal, who just banned me from my home, and now you're here asking me for help. She knows it's Saul, but for some reason she still continues her work. She still consults with Samuel, with this dead spirit who rises from the ground. And then upon hearing Samuel's name, she sees this ghostly figure come from the earth. And Saul's like, what does it look like? And she's like, old dude with a robe. And he's like, Samuel, it's him. That's him. And I guess that's enough details to convince him that it really is Samuel. I love that. It's an old guy, and he's wearing a robe. And Saul feels like, yes, it's finally Samuel. But when Samuel arises from the dead in a spiritual way, he's upset. He's like, why did you wake me up from my slumber? But Saul pleads with him, saying that God is against me and that I'm in great distress and need your help. But Samuel does not give any comforting words here in response to Saul's anguish. Instead, he just says this kind of sore, well, no, duh, that's happening. I told you this would happen. David's up next. I already anointed him. I died, but you didn't obey God. This is on you. In fact, you and your sons will die tomorrow at the hands of the Philistines. Not very compassionate of Samuel, right? But he was a prophet. He wasn't a chaplain, so that's okay. Saul is defeated in this moment. He's completely wiped out. All the places he went to for help have failed. And so he falls flat on the ground, and he's weak because he hasn't eaten, because he's been so stressed and traveling and trying to gain this power that he has no energy, no power, because he's not even feeding himself. And so the witch in this moment looks at him and says, hey, I obeyed what you said. Now you got to listen to me. You got to listen to your servant, because I put my life on the line. I put my life at risk for you. So now you're going to listen to me. I'm going to feed you. And so after some convincing with Saul's men and her keep pushing Saul to eat, he finally agrees to take some food. And as Natalie pointed out, very convenient, there was, a fatted calf there. And so she takes her fatted calf that's in her home and she butchers it herself, which I love that, very feminist move there, I believe. And she makes dinner for all these men. And she even kneads bread, and she makes some homemade bread and gives it to everyone, Saul included. This man that was trying to kill her, make her illegal, she feeds. And it says all the men eat, and they return home that very night. The witch is spared her life in this. She's not killed, like Saul said. But Saul leaves knowing that he has to face his own death the very next day. In my research this week, I tried listening to several podcasts on this, which was kind of frustrating. I don't know. If you're just looking for any religious podcasts, it's kind of a hit or miss what you're going to get. But I found these podcasts of these men talking about the witch of Endor, and they were very yelly. They were screaming at me about how witches are bad, and then it somehow turned in, we need to have our commandments in the courthouse, or it was interesting podcast. They took this story and then they turned it in a very, like, Saul's the bad guy, he's evil, and he went and saw this dirty old witch, and this is bad. And so I kept going to different podcasts because I didn't like those podcasts. And I actually stumbled across a podcast by some modern day witches. And it was the first podcast that finally gave this story some grace. In fact, it seemed that they had a better understanding of the biblical account compared to these angry pastors on these other podcasts. In that podcast, they spoke words of hope, and they pointed out to me that the witch in this story is not deemed bad or evil, and she's not even condemned for her necromancy, talking to the dead. The one who was seen as closest to God at one point, King Saul, is actually the one who's in question here. King Saul was far from God now, far from power, and he was so far that he had to go to this witch to get help, someone he made illegal. And this witch does some surprising things. Although the women in this podcast pointed out that what she was doing was very part of the witch nature. They were being hospitable, taking in someone who needed help. She was doing what her religion, her spirituality taught her to do. But it does come as a surprise to us in a culture where witches are evil for centuries, where we come from a culture where they burned people at stake, calling them witches. But what she does is she offers to help this man who has hurt her. And it's interesting because she could have said no, possibly. She knew her life was on the line, and she knew it was a risk to help this stranger. She could have refused, possibly, but honestly, her life was at risk whether or not she helped him. Because if she helps him, now she's done the thing that's illegal. If she doesn't help him, he's kind of this guy who's losing his sanity. He could react against her. He's trying to get power. She was in a vulnerable state. Saul was risky at this time. He was attempting murder against his closest people. He was grasping for power, even if it meant putting down anyone else that he could. This witch was not safe in her own home because Saul showed up that one night asking for help. And he's selflessly shown up, we should say, to a place that he was not welcomed, where he forced himself into this woman's home that he deemed illegal and whom he forced into migration. And Saul has the nerve to show up and start giving her directions immediately. She doesn't want to help at first, but she does because it's her gift, it's her way of life, and because she doesn't have much choice. The witch talks to the dead and gives Saul the guidance he was looking for, even though it's not necessarily what he was hoping for. Because in this moment, Saul has been rejected by his community, by his God now, who's not answering, and by his mentor Samuel, who just rose from the dead. And now he seeks the help from this woman who he has rejected himself, who in herself is rejected from society now. What an odd flip in power this story is. Saul comes to the witch for help. So Saul, this king, has been humbled low enough to need help from someone that he could have killed willingly and without any cause. He could have killed her a day before for doing what she did for him. And the witch does the most beautiful thing. She listens in on this conversation between Saul and Samuel, and she knows that Saul is going to die the very next day. And what does she do? She tells Saul to listen to her, and then she feeds him. I love that she feeds him in that. The man who could have killed her, the man who forced her into the outskirts of society, she fed him with the fatted calf, and she fed all of his men who could have killed her. She didn't spare anything. She gave them the best of what she had. Saul goes to the witch grasping for power, and yet he receives so much more from her. Saul gets a blessing that even God could not offer to him in this moment. He gets a meal and someone to listen to him. And this relationship doesn't make sense. The person in ultimate power, it seems, who has wielded this power against this oppressed woman, has found himself in a place where she now has the power. She says, "Listen to me, your servant." And in fact, she gives him strength from her food, from her resources, to face the end of his own life. The witch in this story seems to serve as what I like to call Saul's hospice chaplain here. She provides comfort and conversation and a meal in his final hours. So Saul wasn't alone even when he couldn't hear God's voice, because this witch showed up for him. While Saul's story does end the very next day in this very heart-wrenching, gory way with his sons dying too, this witch's story is left untold. She's not praised or condemned, she just is, and we don't get any more of her story. And in her beingness and in the way she shows up, she cares for this defeated person that's in front of her, even if it's the person who wanted harm for her. In talking about this story with our soul team, I mentioned that Saul leaves the place with nothing but a full tummy, and that maybe that's all he needed. He left with a full tummy, which Anna Ocasio, again, I'm going to give her credit for this, she responded with a really loving email that I thought was a great response to that. She said, "Know what else happened?" This is a direct quote. "What always happens at a meal? Conversation. The witch and Saul talked together. I would love to have been a fly on the wall overhearing them talking. Did he pour out his fears? Did she speak words of comfort or just listen? I like to think he left her table with more than a full belly, maybe with a fuller measure of courage and to face his fate. Did she wish him well in her heart as she cleaned up the dishes and fed the scraps to the dogs?" Thank you, Anne, for that. I thought those thoughts were so profound. The witch gave to Saul what no one else in heaven or earth could give him in that moment. She listened to him, she cared for him, she helped him even when her life was in danger. How do we not tell this story more? How is this not one that was preached in more places and more pulpits and more churches? Because what a courageous example of love and grace and forgiveness. And what a poetic story of two rejects whose stories run into each other at a pivotal point in this liminal, holy moment for both Israel and Saul and for this witch, this unnamed woman. This is why her story persists, because it shocks us to our core and reminds us that blessings can come from anywhere, from surprising places, even places that we deem illegal or we actively oppress, even from those places where God's voice is not showing up. Even there, we can get a blessing. Even from someone like this witch from Endor, God can work through. My prayer this week is that we may all be self-aware enough to know when we are the ones in power doing the hurting from a hurt place ourselves. But I also pray that when we are the ones who are oppressed, that we see that we can teach other rejects like us around us what it means to be cared for, even in the midst of darkness and despair, just like this witch did for Saul. And in all of this, I pray that God does not leave us in silence, and that we can hear and sense God through those all around us, just like Saul did with the witch of Endor. Amen.
Amen.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to partake in a meal just like the meal that Saul and this witch had. We don't have a fatted calf, I'll be honest. I didn't have one in the house, so I didn't. And I don't want to slaughter it. Skylar's, vegetarian, so that would not go over well in our home. So instead we're going to have some gluten-free Nilla wafers, which are really great, and we'll have some juice. But what this is this meal is a reminder of all of the meals that come before us. Communion for some people is a very structured thing. It's a certain meal that remembers the Last Supper with Jesus. But I like to think of other Last Suppers, just like Saul's Last Supper with the witch, where he got to share in a meal and he was heard and cared for. And it wasn't some priest or highfalutin person who was giving out the meal. It was someone who was rejected, who the Bible had laws written against. And so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to come to this table humbly, showing up knowing that there's nothing that gives us worthiness to show up except for that we exist, that we show up in the world, that we are welcome to this table because everyone's welcome to this table. I like to say this isn't our table. Physically, yes, it's our table. At Journey, we own it. But this table, metaphorically, is the world's table. All are welcome to it. Not just Christians, not just kings, none of that. It's open for everyone. And I pray that in this meal we can be fed. We can be reminded that this community can feed us. That this community shows us that God shows up even in the mess, in the brokenness, and all the muck. Because what Jesus did is he took bread and he broke it and said, "This is my body. To understand me in this way of life, you have to be broken. You have to be someone who society has thrown or rejected to understand what this is all about. That the table is big enough for all of us." In the same way, he poured out a cup and he said, "It's my blood," which is kind of gross sounding, but he said, "This is also part of me." And this connects us to this new way of life that proves that all of us are welcome at this table. And so I want to welcome you forward to receive communion as you feel comfortable. And Gail, I'll put you on the spot. Could you come up here? If anyone doesn't want to receive communion and would instead like a blessing, Gail's really good at those. Or if you want to get communion and then come in and also check in with Gail, get a prayer or anything like that. She's good at that. So the table is prepared. Come as you're ready. Come if you want to, or don't come. It's okay. All are welcome. Usually Joe would be here to give our blessing, and so I'm so sad he's not. He's at a retirement party for another pastor, so we miss you, Joe. But I want to share a blessing that I was always told at camp. I worked at a church camp for many years, and I think it reminds me of this story. It reminds me that there's no good or bad, there just is, and how it's this kind of mixture of everything. But one of my mentors there that I looked up to, who is actually working to become an Episcopalian priest right now, she would say this blessing every night, and she would say, remember that there is nothing you can do to make God love you anymore. And you can also remember that there is nothing you can do to make God love you any less. So let us live into that truth and go in peace. Amen.
Amen.